Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 336. Everywhere is Jewish. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here for a wrap-up episode on our series of 3 discussions that we did live on location at Leechstag Commons. We are now not live on location at Leechstag Commons, but that's because we've had a little bit of time. Very sadly. But that's because we've had a little bit of time to think about that experience, to reflect on it, to listen to the episodes, and to think about the meaning of it all. And for those who haven't listened to those episodes, first of all, you should. But second of all, just as a quick summary, the Leechstag Foundation, which is located just outside of San Diego, California, has this piece of land, this very large piece of land on which is a farm, a co-working space, a program area, and it's also a foundation that gives out grants, mostly to local organizations in the San Diego area and also in what they call their other location. They're a local foundation with 2 locations, which I like that idea. Their other location where they give grants is Jerusalem, and they also have a co-working space in Jerusalem. So that's an interesting model. But what we really wanted to talk about, or what I'm really interested in talking about at this point, is that I'm excited that we started with the episode about the Leechstag Commons rather than starting with the episode about the Leechstag Foundation, which may have been a more natural place to start. But I like that we started with the Commons because the thing that I'm really excited about and intrigued by in putting together these 3 conversations is the possibility that we could be seeing a model of like a new kind of, unbound Judaism. I mean, I'm not trying to take over their thing. Like that's their Leechstag Commons, that's their thing. But what I'm seeing when we see something like that is the possibility of a new kind of local organization on the ground. I could imagine this in every city that is a hub for a new way of living Judaism, a new way of experiencing Judaism, a new way of experimenting with Judaism. And it really has me excited to dream, but it's less about me trying to give ideas to the Leechstag Foundation because they're doing a good job on their own, but more me sort of trying to feel inspired by what we saw there and wanting to talk about what could be at other places in other cities. And we talked about the possibility that, I think we said maybe in Minnesota, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to have a farm because, what do I know about farming in Minnesota? I'm sure there's a lot of farming in Minnesota and maybe it would make sense. But, in my stereotypical idea of what it's like to be in Minnesota, maybe something that was more active 12 months a year would somehow make more sense. But the idea that there is a place, like a new place, and it's not a synagogue and it's not a JCC, but it does function as a kind of hub that would be well crafted and well suited to any given location, and also that there might be standard things that you find in all the different locations. That's intriguing to me, and I'd love to spend some time with you kind of sorting out what we might find in these spaces.
Yeah, I'm glad you closed with the word spaces, because to me, my big takeaways from this trip to Leechstag Commons and the conversations we've had, it's just all about space and how we utilize space. Because if there's anything, and by the way, part of that, in our first conversation, we talked about public space Judaism, which is this notion that Judaism doesn't have to take place just in not only doesn't it have to, but it doesn't often take place best in Jewish buildings, like a synagogue or JCC. It often happens most effectively, whether that's in homes, that's not public, that wouldn't be public space Judaism, but in grocery stores, in parks, in, farms in this case, or in workplaces, also true of Leechstag Commons through its hive. I find myself really overwhelmed, but in a positive sense, around the question of what if we really allowed ourselves to say Judaism's everywhere? Growing up in Sunday school, I was told God is everywhere. I wasn't really told what that meant, by the way, and I still don't know exactly what was being conveyed to me. I've talked on the show about how I'm a pantheist. I'm actually pretty on board with the idea of God being everywhere, both the fact that God is located in all locations and that God is actually the substance of everything that is everywhere. I'm like on board with that. I don't know what that means in an education context for 5-year-olds, but like I think strongly to my bones that, you know, every moment of my life, no matter where I'm located physically, is like a Jewish moment in potential. It's not always, I don't always actualize that. And by the way, everybody could ask like, oh, what's it mean, Lex, to be a Jewish moment? Like if you're a Jew and you're living, like it's a Jewish moment for you, right? But I mean like actively thinking about that. And, you know, part of why I wear a yarmulke, for example, is because that in a more concrete sense sort of makes my lived experience Jewish in a way that I just sort of like it to be. From my perspective, what Leechtag is doing in every respect, and I think they consciously do this, but also some of it's subconscious, is they're just meditating on what it is to mobilize space productively and Jewishly. And that comes through their farm. So it's a community farm, but we talked about this, like walking around, there's quotes that connect the literal plants that are growing to Jewish texts. There's all sorts of ways in which every piece of the property is being tied to stories or to texts or to ideas in a really productive way. And what that means is if I'm walking around on the property, I don't need to know anything about Judaism for it to be a Jewish moment. I'm like, there's quotes around me and there's ideas and stories in Hebrew. Like, I think that's actually very liberating. I don't have to feel like there's rules I have to follow. I don't have to do the blessings in the right order. I don't have to say the proper words. Like me just being there, that's Jewish. And I think that's part of why they reach so many people, is because it's a stress-free, you're not worried about turning to the right page when you're sitting in a beautiful farm, or even if it's not so beautiful. They pushed me on that. They were like, yeah, there's kind of some bad smells around, not bad, but there's like, you know, there's things that aren't perfect about the place and beautiful in the sense we often mean it, but they're also doing it in the Hive, which is their co-working space, where people who are working for both Jewish organizations and secular organizations are literally opting into a communal ketubah document, a communal like agreement that is anchored in Jewish, I don't want to say values because it's sort of universal values they came up with together, but it's a Jewish idea to call it a ketubah and to put it on a wall in a way that many married couples put that on a wall. So I'm just like, I'm really impressed that sort of every longitude and latitude point on that property has been thought through consciously, and it's not being wasted. And I think a lot of Jewish spaces that I inhabit, I don't think every single piece of that space has been thought through Jewishly. I think there's very much an idea of like, oh, the sanctuary is over here. Jewish stuff happens. Are we organizing our administrative offices through the lens of Jewish values? I don't know that that's always happening. That would be super overwhelming. I'm not critiquing, I'm not saying it's terrible if organizations aren't doing that. But I'm impressed that Leechtag is an example of what it can look like when you really actually come close to doing that 100%.
It's interesting that you bring up that point about the ketubah of the co-working space, because I could imagine in a different Jewish context, somebody would say, oh, why did they call it a ketubah? They should have called it a brit, a covenant, right? Because that's really a Jewish category that has to do with making agreements with one another. Ketubah, that's for weddings, you know? And I actually love the idea that of reversing that and saying, first of all, for a lot of people, a ketubah, a marriage covenant or marriage contract, is much more a kind of Jewish agreement that they feel a connection to than maybe a brit, a covenant with God. You know, we like to say, oh, the covenant with God, that's the thing that we can all agree on. But a lot of people, really, that's alien to them, whereas the idea of a marriage contract is very familiar. And to say we can modify an idea from one part of Judaism and bring it to another part of Judaism is very powerful to me. I did want to just go back to this question of what does a new kind of space in a community look like? If we were imagining, if we were imagining an unbound Jewish future, right? I mean, by that I mean a future that you and I would feel, oh, this new way that the Jewish community is organized kind of meets our dreams. And I think some people think that we're all about online spaces and digital, and it would be full of digital avatars. All of that is, sure, that should be part of it. But I also am thinking always about the physical space. I think physical space is important. And I think there are at least two types of physical space, but there are two types of physical space that I think about a lot. One is the home, that everybody's own home or own space. It doesn't have to be a home. It could be their own office, their car, wherever, where their life takes place in a kind of smaller scale way, that would become a significant, perhaps the most significant Jewish space in a person's life. What would that look like? And that we've talked about a fair bit. But the idea that there would be a space outside the home that would be a very significant Jewish space is something that we've talked about somewhat, but something I'd like to talk about more because we talked years ago now with Casper ter Kuile about the idea of CrossFit or SoulCycle, those kind of gyms being a space like that, being a space that you might see as a kind of spiritual space. And very few people say, hey, why don't you do your workouts at the synagogue? Everybody's kind of like, yeah, I understand.
They might ask, why don't you do your workouts at the JCC? They might.
Well, let's get there.
They do that less too.
Let's get there. Yeah. But I mean, I think that sometimes there's a sense that there are certain kinds of activities that belong in certain Jewish spaces. And if you want to do one of those kinds of activities, like spiritual activities, then people tend to say, why wouldn't you do that in a synagogue? And yeah, like you say, if you want to do things that are more physical activities like workouts, people say, oh, we already have a Jewish space for that, the JCC. But there is an argument to be made, I think, that it's not about whether that synagogue building has the capacity for doing spiritual stuff or that JCC building has the capacity for doing workout stuff. Of course they do. But just because they have the capacity to do a certain thing doesn't mean that people are going to feel comfortable in that space doing that thing. And one option is to say, hey, how can we make them feel more comfortable? Or often what's done, how can we sort of browbeat them into thinking that they should do it in that space, as opposed to saying, no, actually, what they're signaling to us is the need for a new kind of space. And I think that what we're seeing at Leach Commons is a new kind of space that, I mean, there are ways that you could say, well, how is this really different from a JCC? And I think that the main difference between Leach Commons and a JCC in a certain way is that people have come to assume that a JCC looks a certain way. People have come to assume that a JCC has an enormous gym and maybe a pool. And people come to assume that a synagogue has a huge sanctuary as its main focus. And that kind of locks those buildings into a certain kind of feeling for people. And many people feel like those kinds of spaces are not welcoming to them. Not that they're not trying to be welcoming, but they don't feel like the kind of space I'm looking for. Whereas this new kind of space, which in this case is kind of feels like a farm, and it's not just a farm, but it has the feeling of a place where there's a farm. But again, in Minnesota, it might be something else. In New York City, it might be something else. In Phoenix, Arizona, it might be something else. But it feels like a place where I'm a little bit surprised to know that this is a significant hub of Jewish activity. And therefore, all of your assumptions are kind of out the window. By the way, this for me is one of the reasons why it does feel, and I don't blame anybody for going in the wrong direction, but it does feel in retrospect, it may be that we as a Jewish community invested too much in very particularized forms of real estate, as opposed to a different strategy that might have allowed us more easily to move away from certain styles of space when those styles didn't fit what people needed anymore.
Yeah, I'm super into what you're saying. You're helping me articulate in words some stuff that's just been floating around in abstractions in my head. So what you just said about how there's a sense of what the rules are at the JCC. I think the JCC is a good example because the JCC is not a synagogue. I want to be clear. Like, I'm aware that, and I love JCCs, and we shout out at the beginning of our episodes our wonderful supporter, the Oshman family JCC. Like, but there is absolutely a sense, not a 1,000-year-old sense, but maybe a many decades sense of like, this is roughly what a JCC is. There's probably a gym. There's, a mixture of social activities, some holiday stuff, but probably through a prism that is not called religious in the way that synagogues are, or if it is, it's like a softer kind of religion, maybe shorter liturgy, maybe more family friendly. Like, there's a sense of what that is, and a lot of it's really good, but there's still rules. When I say rules, I mean there's just like structure. There's just a sense of what it is, and a lot of what I want, and I think what a lot of other Jews want, is not knowing what it is. Because when you don't know what the Jewish is, and I know I keep on using Jewish as if it's a noun, and I'm going to just keep doing that. But like, when you don't know what the Jewish is, all of a sudden you're creating it. Like that's what's exciting. And so I'm realizing that when you and I have talked about, like, we got to get beyond just the synagogue spaces, we got to get beyond the Hillel buildings, we got to get beyond the JCC building. Like, it's not about those spaces being insufficient or bad. It's that, once you have a space with, in a synagogue situation, pews that are literally like anchored into the ground, or a bima that is anchored to the ground. Like, if I walk into certain synagogue spaces, what I can do to create whatever kind of Jewish I want to is limited just because like the room is oriented a certain way. And that's true of every space. That's true of a forest. That's true of an office building. That's true. Like, there are rules to these spaces. But if I walk into a forest or a farm and I'm doing something Jewish, everybody there, I think, is kind of operating under the sense that, like, okay, this is going to be off the beaten path. This is not going to follow every rule. They might or may not like that. Some people that are going to engage with a Jewish event in the forest or on a farm or in an office space or in a random pop-up that you've rented to do something Jewish, like, some people actually might be sitting there like grumbling, like, this doesn't quite feel like what Jewish is supposed to be. And that's not really who I'm talking to. Who I'm talking to is the people who actively are jazzed about living a Jewish. Let's take a protest. Like, people know that protests happen in the streets, but from my perspective, it's actually not about the protest. It's like, I like gathering with a bunch of Jews and others in the streets to do, something that's either multi-faith or Jewish or both. Because when I'm standing outside of the Capitol building in Providence, what I do Jewishly is by definition not going to follow all the rules. And everybody who goes to that knows that. They know that they're going to, and they're likely to go. Like, if people don't like the rules and structures of institutions, when you place something in a different space, then people are more likely to go and participate. And that's what Leach-Tag talked about with why people are willing to go to the farm when they're not necessarily excited about being members of a synagogue or a JCC. It's not so much that we're trashing those places. It's more of a sense of like, wow, what an opportunity to make X public space Jewish for an hour. For an hour, not for always. I'm not saying the Capitol building in Providence is a Jewish space. That would be problematic on all sorts of levels. I am saying that there's like a unique magic going to a place that is actually not marked as Jewish and making it so. How cool is it to be able to Jewify whatever spaces? What if we conceptualized all the folks that are not synagogue members and not JCC members? What if we thought of them not as people who are actively not X? They're not synagogue members. They're not looking to share those spaces. What if we thought of them as, wow, this is a population of people that wants to Jewify the world? That sounds kind of evangelical. I don't mean it necessarily that way, but like, this is a set of people who want to do Jewish stuff in the bookstore. PJ Library does things like that in the books. This is a set of people who want to, for 10 minutes, have a conversation with their friend in the matzah aisle, as, Big Tent Judaism did with their public space Judaism programs. This is people who want to go to a farm. This is like, I'm somebody who wears a yarmulke all the time because I want to find Jewish everywhere. It's not that I don't want to find it in the synagogue. It's just that feels limiting. Why only operate in those spaces when we have the entire world? So I think that's kind of a reframe that directs us away from this sense that people who are, going to Leach-Tag's programs, that they are non-synagogue members, that they are non-JCC members, and actually starts to get us on a pathway to be like, oh, there are some folks who love doing Jewish in specifically marked Jewish spaces for a variety of reasons. I am also that person sometimes, but I'm more often the person who wants to go on a random trip somewhere and find a way to make the random street corner I'm at feel Jewish for a second. I'm sounding orthodox. I'm sounding like a Chabadnik that goes out onto the street and asks people to wrap tefillin wherever the most people are gathered. But I actually kind of am on board with that. I just don't agree with the kinds of Jewish those folks are looking to advocate.
Sure. Well, I'm interested in that too. But how do you square that? I mean, this is something else, right? Because this is, at least maybe not everybody experiences it this way, but this is a space that is marked Jewish. In other words, this isn't just going to the aisle in your grocery store. I mean, this is a place that is a Jewish place. But I'm thinking, for me, what's intriguing is that this is a place that that I might come every week, but it's a different kind of place that's marked Jewish. I'm thinking a little bit, as you were talking, I was thinking about, years...
This is good because we're definitely different on this. I just want to flag, keep going.
Okay, well, years ago when we were just starting out in the podcast, and I kept saying that I would be looking for a protest-based Shabbat morning service. In other words, I would not like to come to a synagogue to do a Shabbat morning service, but if there was always a, protest at the time I was talking about, in front of Trump Tower in Chicago, but, if there was a protest that would just take place, it could be a traveling protest, it could be protesting all kinds of things. But, there was prayer, and the immediate understanding of that prayer was action, right? That spoke more to me than going to a specifically marked Jewish space just to do something Jewish and then go home. I'm starting to feel like a space like this could be a complement or an alternative to what I'm talking about, in the sense that rather than maybe bringing the prayer, the Jewish activity to the place of action, like to the protest, for example, there's a way of saying that we're bringing the Jewish to a place of action, a place that's inherently a place of action, activity, rather than a place that's inherently just Jewish in the limiting sense. So what I mean is that this is primarily a farm or a place of agriculture, and we are bringing a long-term Jewish presence to this place, whether it's prayer or learning or activity, but it's inherently connected to the action that's taking place in this place, right? But in that sense, it's also a distinction from a JCC or a synagogue. And by the way, when I say JCC or synagogue, I don't mean every JCC and every synagogue. There are some synagogues that are doing a fantastic job, and there are JCCs that are doing a fantastic job, like the Ashman family JCC in Palo Alto. And part of what enables them to do it is also that their physical plant is unusual for a JCC. For example, the Ashman family JCC, its physical plant is unusual, which also opens up the possibility that other kinds of things can happen there. So in a way, it's a reframe of the idea that, there used to be Jewish hospitals in every city. Now, the reason why there were Jewish hospitals was a completely different reason. It was because Jews were not allowed to be doctors in the other hospitals. But nevertheless, there was a hospital. Its primary purpose was not to do Jewish prayer and stuff. Its primary purpose was to heal sick people. And often those Jewish hospitals were really, really good. And I imagine that actually was some good PR for the Jews, saying like, if you're really sick and you go to this hospital, hey, the Jewish hospital cured you, hopefully you'll be a little bit less of an anti-Semite. Here, I'm thinking like if the greatest place for art in a given city is the Jewish place, that starts to be an interesting thing for the city at large to sort of understand. I would think that one of the ways that Leachtag Commons is regarded in the San Diego area is one of the most awesome places for community farming. And then to say, okay, well, what now are the Jewish things that should take place in this space that is totally awesome, even if you didn't even know it was Jewish, right? And then what are the new kinds of Jewish things that would only enhance that? Because we're already seeing, for example, at Leachtag, the idea that, okay, to make this community farm even more awesome, we're going to study a lot of Jewish sources about farming and really try to bring those ideas, tithing, for example, or leaving the corners of the field. We're really going to take that seriously and to create this free farm stand for people in the community who need that, right? Now, what would really be interesting to me is now once we start studying things other than the farming subjects, once we start studying things like marriage, oh, wow, we have an idea now for a new way to think of a covenant, right? Or once we start thinking about all kinds of Jewish topics, which are seen just as narrowly. You and I have complained about Shemitah being seen so narrowly as just about agriculture. And what if we really took Shemitah and other farming concepts and applied them more broadly? I'm also thinking about what if we took all the other fields of Judaism other than farming and applied them to farming, what would that turn into? And then we would have an even more awesome farm, and it would just be this incredible virtuous cycle.
Yeah, okay, so this is really cool. I think we're both on the same page and coming at it from different desires for like what our personal dreams for a Jewish community would be, but I don't think that they're conflicting desires. I think that we're like two different constituents of a hypothetical future Jewish community of our dreams that would exist for both of us, but we would access it differently. And what I mean by that is I don't think that what I want is for me. new Jewish spaces, like spaces that are labeled Jewish but are doing a broader set of things. Like Leashtag, you're right to say that Leashtag Commons is marking itself as a Jewish space. Now, I happen to think that inherently, if you are doing something outside, it just automatically can't be just Jewish. Like it can't. It doesn't work. Like if you've got walls and a title on your building, you can have that be a Jewish building, and the experiential sense that people have walking into that building is that they are walking in to a Jewish space. If you're outside, that goes away. Like, so even an outside space, and this is why Jewish camps, I think, are so magical, because yes, you walk through often like a gate or something, but it's different. You're in trees and lakes and farmland and whatever, and that stuff exists everywhere. And sure, you could say pews exist in other places, and chairs and office and desks and doors, all the things that are in synagogues. You could say those exist everywhere, but it's different when you walk through a space that has a sign out front it's just different. And also, by the way, Leashtag does label itself a Jewish space, but the way they understand what it is to be a Jewish space is inherently to be also a secular space. That's why secular organizations can use their co-working area. It's why secular organizations use a huge percentage of the acreage of their farmland for all sorts of different purposes. Like, they understand that the Jewishness not only doesn't need to mean that non-Jews aren't there, but actually it should mean specifically that non-Jews are there. Just like in the Bible, there's non-Jews that are part of the Israelite mixed multitude that leaves Egypt. Like, that's what this whole project should be. And so I'm with you on that, but I think that if we created outdoor spaces, even if we label them Jewish in the way that you're saying, I'd want to be part of a protest group that does, like, that would be better, because you wouldn't be entering in this literal physical sense. Like, there's certain things that happen to our bodies. We're not choosing to do this, but like when you walk into a building, you have a set of connotations for that building. That's true of any building. And so when you're outside, those go away. I also agree with you. We should work to change the connotations of what a synagogue building is, or what a JCC building is. I love that more and more synagogues and more JCCs are looking to have, movable pews and rooms that can be reorganized in different ways, and outdoor spaces that are still like within the property of the synagogue or the JCC, but they're outside. Like, all of that is great. And so there's like a hybrid here. But like, what I want to name is, my dream is really not that we have a new set of Jewish institutions that I would join in the way that I'm not joining now. Like, my dream is that we'd set up Jewish institutional ecosystems that are a mixture of specific spaces that people like you would use more than me, and just a conception that, I'm bringing up camps again. If you're at a summer camp, you've got a few hundred campers around, and like, you have to do programs at any given time. So you are forced by definition to use a ton of that space, because you can't have 300 campers like in one spot. So you have to figure out, if you're a camp counselor or a unit leader or whatever, you often get the less desirable space, because like, you have to rotate. So somebody gets the nice big dining hall to do their program, and one night you get the like behind the cabin in like a not so open area, and you have to figure out what you're doing, and it has to be Jewish. And it forces you to think like, okay, I have to figure out what the program is for these campers, and it's going to be fun because we're at camp and it has to be fun. And if we had that sense that, okay, I live in Providence, Rhode Island, this, 4 miles by 5 miles of city is in effect our camp, and we have to figure out how we're going to do Jewish stuff in every place in this 4 mile by 5 mile. It's something like that. That's about the dimensions of Providence. Nobody email me and say that's wrong. But like, if that was our idea, I think we'd reach more people, because it turns out Jews live in a broader set of areas than we often think. And when you place events near to folks, they show up in a way that they don't at the institutions that are often in specific sub-communities of broader cities. And we'd come up with new ideas. We'd say, oh, if this area that's like mostly industrial and not pretty farmland, if we had to do a service here, what would we do? Would we notice things about the land around us that we don't usually? Would we notice names of streets? Oh, is there a name of a street that ties to a story Jewishly? Play that game sometime. Drive around your town and see how many street names tie to a biblical character or to a location or to a story. It's a lot. But when we frame it as anything that we do outside of Jewish institutions is like threatening, because we're telling people that they don't have to be members. We're telling people they can experience Jewish anywhere and not just in Jewish buildings. Like, that's limiting us. And so I hope that both, and institutions can do this too. You can still be a synagogue and hold a program in a location that's not your synagogue. That's great. That's what we should be doing. So my striving is in many ways more towards a conception where we're kind of, I don't want to sound like I'm conquering. We're not conquering this land to take away from Christians or Muslims or Hindus or other people. But I'm looking to say, like, how would every park, every street corner, every public building, everything be potentially a place where Jewish conversation, Jewish liturgy, Jewish whatever can happen, as long as we're not breaking establishment clauses. Like, that's kind of what I'm getting.
That doesn't exist anymore, so it's okay.
Right.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying, in that, that would be awesome too. On what you said about, there's nothing holding synagogues back from having programs in public spaces. That's true technically, except that at a certain point, if you realize, as I think you inevitably would, if you really gave it your all, that those spaces will be much more welcoming. That's where people will want to go. They'll be much more open to that. At a certain point, you kind of like, well, why do we still have this building? And there becomes a certain cognitive dissonance. And also, there's a problem. I mean, that a lot of your resources are invested in that building. And it's both the cognitive dissonance. It's also the fact that you're feeling like we have to make use of it because we've got the investment. It's just psychology. It ends up that it's really hard to do what you should do. So there's a certain benefit. I mean, there's a certain benefit of what Miriam Turlinchamp did in just kind of selling the building and then, putting half the money in a lockbox just in case this doesn't work out, right? And then using the other half of the money to experiment and try to figure out what we can do.
I'll link to her episodes in the show notes for all you out there listening, by the way, just so you understand what that shout out was.
Yeah. But I want to talk about another element, because I agree with everything that you're saying about, it just shouldn't even only be on one piece of land. But there is the benefit of the co-working, which I also want to talk about, because there are a number of Jewish co-working spaces that exist around the country. There's one in New York, there's one in Chicago. I think there's a few more that are basically offices, and they're wonderful. There's something to me that's even better if that office, that shared office space, is attached to a program space in which joint programs can be done. And now some of them have like a big room in the office space. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, like you're talking about earlier, that pluripotential, that incredible canvas on which all kinds of amazing programs can take place. Probably that means a lot of it would be outside. And I'm just sort of, when I was at Leech-Tag, I was just sort of imagining, like, what if there in this co-working space, we had a person for Judaism Unbound, and next to them was a Svara person, and next to them was a Jewish Studio Project person, and all these organizations that we love and that we think are unbound. I mean, a Kohenet was there, right? And I don't want to like call out people because then I'm not saying other people, but I'm just imagining like, and that's not just in one city, that's in every city. But that it was a place where there was this critical mass of different Jewish organizations working together, but they're aligned in that the sort of experimentation, creativity is fundamental to who they are. And none of those organizations, like in a certain way, this solves a certain problem that I struggle with, right? Which is that none of those organizations have enough resources to have a full office in every city, and probably not even in one or two extra cities beyond wherever they are. If there were a way of collaborating with other aligned organizations, maybe there's a financial model that we start to see of the possibility that every city in America could have, in the world, could have a critical mass of not just one person in the town, but a critical mass of people who are really thinking creatively and differently, and that really kind of vibe with that pluripotent space as well, right? So it's a pluripotent space like Leech-Tag Commons, but then there's also a pluripotent staff, right? Which is not representing one organization and the mission of one organization. It's actually representing something in between the missions of a number of organizations. And I was starting to imagine that, and not just at Leech-Tag, because this is not a pitch for Leech-Tag. This is jumping off of that experience and imagining something that could exist.
So it's like if Leech-Tag is in a game of Leech-Tag and they say Leech-Tag, you're it. To every other city.
Yeah, but everybody's it.
Sorry, I had to say that because I'm a terrible, terrible human being.
But but it's like that. I mean, it's like, but again, I think what I'm trying to say, and thank you for focusing on, is like when we interview people on Judaism Unbound, most of the time they're doing some project locally. And I'm always thinking about what would it look like if that project wasn't local, wasn't national, was multi-local. Is that could be a new word? Multi-local? What would it look like, almost like, to spawn these things? And the thing that always breaks down for me is if you have all of these little mini svaras everywhere, these little mini Kohenets or little mini Jewish studio projects or little mini Judaism Unbound or on yeshivas, how is one person in a locality going to bring the magic of the many years and maybe the founder that is in this place? Obviously, if you have a staff that is kind of tight and is all working together, there's a certain power that the organization can project. But then what happens is those organizations tend to turn into national organizations, which have a certain value, but they're not local in a real way. Whereas if you have local organizations all over the country that are kind of teaming up, I think that could work.
Yeah, I really like this multi-local thing. I'm also thinking about, we started by saying this isn't about digital stuff. I do think this is also about digital stuff because I think digital modalities lend themselves to the multi-local naturally because you connect with other people that share your interests in, a Zoom gathering or in a Facebook group or in whatever digital thing, and you're living wherever you're living. If you and 10 or 50 or 300 people all share a certain connection digitally, and then you live in different places, well, a bunch of you can start up small versions of whatever that thing is in your community. And some people's, this is like what Shemitah Hives has done, or we've talked with If Not Now and Never Again Action. Like really, those are kind of decentralized, multi-local things. We talk about them as national, and they are national, but like really, and Moishe House even. Moishe House has a ton of different cities, but you go to their website and it lists all of their individual cities. And within one city, there can be multiple Moishe Houses because they recognize that they're really multi-local. It's like Moishe House doesn't exist everywhere in the United States.
Yeah,
it's not accurate to say that it is national in that sense. When we talk about like national government, that means that like everybody living in the country has some stake in it. Now we could talk about how Washington DC doesn't get to vote for the Senate, but like generally that's the premise. So multi-local is actually the norm, and a lot of organizations that are multi-local, they kind of frame themselves as national because I think it's better for funders to be like, we're national, than it is to say like, we reach 9 cities really well and the rest of the country we kind of don't reach. Like that would be a more honest statement of a lot of organizations. And I'm not saying that to be an asshole. Like I think that that's true of many really great organizations. If you're reaching 9 cities or even 5 cities in a meaningful way, and you're not reaching everybody else, like that's still really important work. And it might be that the cities you're reaching share a certain set of characteristics. It might be that there's a lot of people in those cities that are interested in earth-based Jewish stuff. So like you work more with Berkeley and with Western Massachusetts, those kinds of places. It might be that you're reaching people that are in Austin, Texas, and in Palo Alto, and in other like tech hubs. I'm making up random situations, but like we should celebrate the networks of like multi-local things that sometimes are branded as national. The other thing I'd say is you actually made me think of something we've been doing the last few years, which I haven't really thought about as particularly deep, but I think is another avenue for this, which is our partnership with New Voices Magazine. Like New Voices Magazine is a tiny, in terms of resources, they're also a digital project like us. But in terms of resources, like they're a long-standing, really wonderful legacy organization, but they don't have a ton of money. But what they've done the last few years, they've set up a way where they have this fellowship where people who are working for New Voices are also simultaneously working for Judaism Unbound and for Lilith Magazine and for JWA and so like we actually don't need to frame this as, and I mean, I'm not saying you did a bad thing, Dan, in framing it this way, but like you talked about sort of people who work for one organization could co-work with other people who work for another. Svara people could work next to Kohenet people, could work next to JSP. We could actually have more positions in Jewish life where people are simultaneously working for multiple projects. Because if we in New Voices can set that up in a position that is 10 hours a week part-time for college students, that's actually harder to do, to allocate 10 hours meaningfully to two different projects. Like we've figured out a way to do that, but like if we had a 40-hour full-time staff person who is splitting their time between two projects, that's a way to get at this too. Like we could have people that are actually employees of, I'm not saying Kohenet and Svara specifically have to do this, but like you could have somebody who is an ordained Kohenet and also is a Svara educator who is working for both. Or you could have somebody who is a synagogue educator. You could have somebody who works for a synagogue, but also as their job is working for a secular organization or something where they're doing stuff out in the community that's not in the synagogue building. I think we can get really creative about this as long as we are really asking the question over and over again, how do we use all our space? If we conceptualize that as a real aspiration for our Jewish community, not just sort of the promotion of more and deeper and better Jewish spaces with Jewish names, I think we'd actually really rock and roll in ways that we haven't so far.
So let's, before we end this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the other thing that I kept obsessing over as I was hanging out at Leachtag Commons, which was the possibility that the farm people, for example, would have the opportunity every week to study with someone from the Jewish Studio Project or with someone from Svara, to name a couple. And I was just thinking, like, what if folks who generally work on a Jewish-themed community farm are studying Talmud through a queer lens, but they're studying topics that have nothing directly to do with farming, or that they're focusing on, just for an hour or two or however many a week, on the experience of using art as a way of unlocking meanings from other Jewish texts, again, that have nothing to do with farming. And I'm not aware of a project yet, maybe there is one and I'm just not aware of it, that really focuses on, well, on the most narrow way, Jewish farm folks studying non-farm texts and see what happens. Mm-hmm. But there's a much broader point to that, which is a world in which people of all kinds of activities, some of them being Jewish in that they like work on a Jewish farm or they work for a Jewish social justice organization, but also, you know, doctors and lawyers and whatever. But I mean, I'm saying that, like, I think that normally the thinking is folks who work in a particular area should study Jewish texts about that area. And of course, that's an awesome idea, and amazing things have come from that. So this is not at all critical. It was just that when I was there, I kept having this feeling of like, oh my gosh, like what would happen if these folks were studying other texts, because they would come up with these incredible ways of applying that to farming in a way that, you know, may just never have developed, because in the past, you know, when these texts were initially written, farming was largely an activity that people engaged with for the most human of reasons, to get food, you know, that they needed to eat. I mean, and so they were really focused on that. But in a world in which the farm is doing that, but also is understood to be doing much more than that, potentially be playing a role in impacting people who will never be farmers, as a community farm does. And that was really, I think, something that I have come to understand about the difference between a community farm and a Jewish farm, where Jewish farmers are farming food, but it's not really as like plugged into the wider community. My understanding is like a community farm is there for people who will never become farmers to have experiences on the farm that would translate beyond the farm. What would it be like if it were also going in the other way as well? And, you know, again, we've said this about Shemitah, that there's so many concepts in Shemitah that apply beyond the farm, and vice versa. So that was opening up for me the possibility that there could be a new kind of yeshiva, a new kind of Beit Midrash, Jewish study center that may or may not be co-located on farms or co-located on these large new organizations that every city in America is going to have that are, right for their organization. But the idea that there could be, again, a new form of Jewish study, and there's almost an expectation that people should be studying the texts that relate to their, and not only texts, right, all kinds of other things that relate to their most narrow interest, but also the things that don't relate, and to see what comes. I mean, I guess I'm sort of reinventing liberal education, but from a Jewish point of view.
But you're not fully, because liberal educations typically take place at a point in people's lives before they have gone off and become established in whatever field they're doing, their careers, whatever. Like, I think what you might be reinventing in certain senses is what I experienced in Aleph as a rabbinical student, where I would be sitting in class and you're not even really fully reinventing this, but it's similar to an Aleph, where I would be sitting in class and like one of my classmates is a math professor in Mississippi, and another of my classmates, a divorce lawyer. That was often really interesting when talking about things related to families and whatever in Jewish texts. And another person works in a Jewish context for, Judaism your way. And another person works for a Hillel. And another person is a psychologist. And another person, one of my closest friends, is a surgeon, or was a surgeon for decades of his life. Like the learning is different when when you learn with each person. And this is why I have multiple chavrutas that I learn. Like, I think it's cool that in the Talmud we hear about these pairs, these people that like learned text specifically with one other person. They had this really deep relationship, and they almost to the point of romantic connection, and in certain ways, maybe even more than romantic connection. I don't have one chavruta. I have a bunch of different people that I regularly like sit down and study Jewish texts with of different kinds, because I think that the learning is actually different. I think you're right that farmers specifically, like, I would say that any field of human beings, nice pun, farming field, any field of human beings, whether that's farming or anything else, like a group full of those people could gather and study Talmud or study Bible or study whatever, and fundamentally different and equally valuable things would arise. Like, gather together a bunch of professional basketball players to talk about a Jewish holiday, like, things would be noticed. That, like, it goes to B'nai Lappi's idea of donkey stories. Like, you find things that relate to you, the donkey who is learning Torah would notice all the things that mention donkeys. I will notice things that connect to, my interfaith relationship. And I'll also notice things that connect to the word providence, because I live in a place called Providence. So if a text mentions divine providence, I smirk, and I notice that more than other people do, which is not them doing anything wrong. So what farming has that some of those other fields don't is, like, literally practically, there are things that farmers understand that you and I don't. Like, hearing in last week's episode, Adam talk about, like, parsley is on the Seder plate for all your, like, enjoy your symbolic nice meanings, Lex and Dan. Like, parsley arises in the spring. And if you're a farmer, you know that. And so it's symbolic of spring. And so you put it on the Seder plate for that reason. And, like, you want to dip it in salt water and talk about how it connects to tears and slavery, like, go for it. But, like, that's also part of why it's there. And apples in the fall, we heard from Kesha about how, like, you notice the beginnings of apples coming to be many months before that. And then in fall, there's more of them. Like, we do need that knowledge. You and I need that now. And so, like, those people who are farmers, I'd love to set up that beautiful Yavne, that, like, place for them to learn with each other and create their own Talmud. I mentioned that last week. Like, I'm genuinely interested in completing the Talmud on the agricultural part called Zera'im, which there's Mishnah, but there's not Babylonian Talmud. I'm interested in a bunch of people who work as farmers or Jewish community farms, like, coming together and doing that work. And then, like, they teach me, right? Like, I'm a rabbi, but I don't know what they know. But I'm also interested in a group of people where, like, you consciously have one artist and one farmer. Not that these are mutually exclusive categories, but y'all get it. You have one artist, you have one farmer, you have one, like, Jewish educator or somebody who works in Jewish life, but they're not in charge. They're just one of the people. You have one lawyer, you have one person who works in food service, you have one like, if we had, like, 100 of those groups of 10 people, that would be the most exciting thing ever. And I think that the actual text would be fundamentally different than what we tend to have now, which is like rabbis studying stuff together in yeshivas. And it would actually resemble the original Talmud more, because in that book, like you and I have talked about a million times, you've got Rabbi X, the sandal maker. You've got all these people that do other jobs, and they're bringing that expertise into the conversations they have.
I am looking forward to giving more sustained thought to this, because I almost feel like, you know how we've probably mentioned this on the show before, but classically people talk about Shabbat as a taste of the world to come. So, you know, once a week you get this taste of how the future could be in this, you know, messianic, idealized world. And then you spend the rest of the week trying to get just one little smidgen closer to that. And that's all we can do, you know, but then every week we get kind of a taste. And I think we could think about Shemitah that way. You know, every 7 years you get a little bit of a taste of how something could be different. And we've been spending this year really talking about that. And I'm not even saying that Leach-Tag Commons is the full taste, because it's still a work in progress, as everybody there would say. But there was something that I've experienced over the last 3 weeks, and that I experienced over the days that we were there, that gave me a sense of something new has been bubbling for quite a while. And in this particular spot, we may be getting a taste of what it could look like if all that stuff kind of bubbled together and started to, you know, really. I mean, I've also used the metaphor of the primordial soup before, where the molecules bang into each other, and, you know, every once in a while they bang into each other and stay together. You know, something even more solid is created. And there's something about this experience that I'm holding where I'm starting to feel like I can taste what it would look like when those molecules start to bang together. So I'm excited.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. I would love, and we would love to hear from listeners what your takeaways were for this set of 4 episodes. 3 recorded on location and this closing episode. But we're really hoping that we can continue to sit with this and meander our way towards new pathways for a Jewish future. So send us those notes. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can be in touch with us. There's our Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can see the previous episodes in this series and any of our other episodes that tie to what we've been talking about. There's our emails. Like, we really, really love hearing from all of you. And if you have a long-winded or short-winded or medium-winded question or thought on any of these episodes, we really love hearing. And you can send those at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. So the last request we'd like to make is that if you've appreciated these episodes, or if you just are really feeling grateful for Judaism Unbound generally, we're grateful to you too, especially if you're able to set aside any money to financially support us in any way, which you can do via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 65 more days of Shemitah.